With 2 days remaining for version 4.3 as the next one is coming upon us, the banners have been officially revealed by Hoyo himself. Since I'm too lazy to edit, I'm going to quickly go over all the different banners, and especially mostly the weapon banners and the rated up 4 stars. If you guys want to know what I think about Shen Yun and Nahida, just go check out the Should You Pull video for version 4.4, and there should be a card right above me on the top right section. So let us start off with the character banner. With the 3 rated up, we have Noelle, Faruzan, and Ga-Ming. So we'll start from top to bottom. Noelle is going to be quite interesting because if you were to ask me before Furina came out, I think Noelle is definitely not a very high value pull, given that Noelle herself, she's more of a jack of all trades character where she can do decent damage, she can kind of act as a tank, and she has the ability to heal. Granted that you do need to be on field, and her damage is not that great even at C6, and you do need like your supports to be like quite leveled up, like a C6 Goro or C6 Yunjin. But ever since Furina got released, I think her value has skyrocketed immensely than the pre-Furina time. I think nowadays you can actually run her as like an on-field DPS with Furina, and I think her damage will actually be quite decent. And even if you don't, what you could do is probably run her kind of like Noelle as the on-field healer alongside with Furina, and you maybe slap on Goro or Zhongli, and maybe use another Hydro like Xingqiu or Yelan on that team to drive Furina's healing so that you can actually achieve maximum damage. But Noelle's value has definitely increased quite a lot ever since Furina's release, and I would say she's actually quite decent now. If we were to quickly review her constellations, so C1 I think is the most important one. Basically, if your skill and burst is up at the same time, every hit you do will trigger the skill's healing by guaranteed to 100%. This is especially good because for those who don't know, her skill, if you have a shield up, right, every time Noelle hits an enemy, there's a chance to trigger a healing that scales off a defense. However, I have level 13 and the highest is probably 60%. You cannot get guaranteed unless you have C1. So if you do have C1 and you have both her burst and her skill up, her healing is actually quite potent. So C2 is quite minor, I think. It decreases stamina consumption of a charge attack and increases charge attack damage, so definitely a bit more of a helpful for like a charge attack DPS build. C3 adds 3 levels to the shield, more tanky, which is not bad. Her C4 is quite interesting. It's more of a minor damage increase. Basically, whenever her shield expires, it will do like 4 times the damage of base of Noelle's attack as a geo damage. And if you do have your burst up, because Noelle's burst converts a portion of her defense into attack, when the shield explodes, when your burst is still up, the damage should actually go pretty high. C5 adds 3 levels to the burst, a very kind of negligible constellation. C6 is the DPS constellation where basically like her burst converts even more defense into attack because Noelle's abilities mostly scale off attack. And for every enemy she defeats, she adds like 1 second to the burst duration. This can actually be quite useful against like multiple waves of enemies where you basically want to extend your ability, like you don't have enough energy for your burst. You don't want it to really end quite yet. So C6 is basically mostly the DPS constellation. Overall, to quickly kind of summarize Noelle, if you want to run her with Furina, she's actually quite good in her own kind of mono Geo or double Hydro team. Otherwise, you can definitely run her as a DPS without Furina, although I personally think that her value is not that great without. For the second character, oh, well, this is going to be interesting because we have Faruzan, which the irony of having Faruzan not on Xiao's banner, it really is beating any potential Xiao mains or Faruzan mains, or maybe specifically Xiao mains who want to get like constellation for the Faruzan, so any Wanderer mains want to pull it. So I find it pretty funny. So Faruzan's main goal is to be kind of like an ANEMO support, but not in the regular way that you would usually think of like Venti or Kazuha, but mostly her role is to buff the damage done by ANEMO hyper carry characters. Well, mostly ANEMO characters. Having more constellations on Faruzan, I think it's very, very good. Like, she's definitely very potent, especially for any Wanderer mains or Xiao mains like such as myself who have both, who are gunning for their C6 but can't be bothered to get more constellations on Wanderer, or you don't want to wait like 3 years for her to come up. So let's quickly go over her constellations. C1 allows her to fire 2 of the special charge shots whenever you activate the elemental skill. This is mostly a small quality of life update because it doesn't actually allow you to generate more energy since she does have a cooldown on the particle generation. I think it's mostly useful for maybe a bit more damage and grouping, but mostly if you have a skill issue and you miss your first shot, so the second shot can still hit and trigger the particle generation. C2 I think is one of her most important abilities because her burst only lasts for 12 seconds and C2 actually extends that by 6, thus making it 18 seconds. And this is quite important for running hypercarry teams like Xiao or Wanderer because usually Faruzan's burst, you would ideally use it after Bennett's burst is up, but by doing so, you're actually decreasing the amount of time your ANEMO hypercarry can benefit from Bennett's attack buff. However, with C2, you can actually get by putting her burst up first because not only does it last longer, which allows you to let your ANEMO hypercarry take all of Bennett's buff for themselves, that duration is especially helpful for someone like Xiao, whose burst ability lasts for like 15 seconds while Bennett's burst only lasts for 12. C3 adds 3 levels to the skill, I think this one doesn't really do anything. C4 is a very nice quality of life. Every time the skill triggers the suction effect, it will regenerate a flat amount of energy to Faruzan. Yeah, it's just a small quality of life thing, but this one is made to work with C6. C5 adds 3 levels to the burst, which I believe is actually quite helpful because it increases the amount of ANEMO resistance. I think, yeah, ANEMO damage bonus. The ANEMO resistance is kept at like 30%. C6 is a bread and butter. Anyone under effect of the ANEMO buff like will get like 40% increased ANEMO crit damage. And the biggest part is that whenever the active character deals damage while they have the buff, they will apply the same suction that comes from Faruzan's skill, which is especially helpful for someone like Wanderer or like Xiao, because Xiao's plunging attack does knock people back. So this is a very good constellation, and I think the damage buff is rather massive because from my experience, my Faruzan's only C1. I can't even run teams like Xiao hyper carry or Wanderer hyper carry without struggling a lot because the damage ceiling is just not high enough. So I'm actually quite excited to get Constellation 6 of Faruzan for my account, and wish me luck on that end. So hopefully I can get that and not having to pull extra pulls to get C1 Shen Yun. For the last 4-star, we have Ga-Ming. Ga-Ming is advertised to be a plunging attack DPS with his elemental skill and the cooldown thing. Basically, his skill makes him like, I think it hits at lunge forward or hits an enemy, and then it does a special plunge which is infused with pyro. And then his burst basically summons a little thing that tries to hit the nearby enemy, and once it hits, it comes back to him and resets his skill cooldown so he can do more plunges. He is quite an interesting rendition of what a plunge attack DPS would be if it wasn't Xiao, and I've heard good things about him, whether it be official or unofficial information, but I would be quite interested to see how well he's able to do at C0. I think he's going to be okay. Very likely his constellations are going to make him better. I pray to God that's actually true, and hopefully I have enough resources to build him because it's going to take a while and I'm a low spender, but doesn't mean I have enough resources for that. So for the weapon banner, let's quickly go over this quickly. I think the weapon, I can go pull up the image real quick from Hoyo. So the weapon, as you can see here, is very likely Shen Yun's best in slot weapon. It's basically kind of like a paper fan catalyst weapon. So it has the same stat as Calamity Queller, very low attack percent, very high base attack. So let's see what the passive does. After the equipping character hits an enemy with a plunging attack, all plunging attacks will deal additional damage for a short period, of like 20 seconds or something. And if any members hit any enemies aside from the user herself with any plunging attacks, they will restore a flat amount of energy to the character. I think this is actually one of the better weapons, and I would argue this is probably better than Calamity Queller. The problem with Calamity Queller is that despite having the same stat, the passive provides like an all damage percent, and then if you were to use your skill, it basically increases the attack percent for the wielder and it becomes even stronger. The effect is doubled if the character's off field, but the problem with that is that Shenhe, you do want her burst to be up in order to provide the maximum amount of buffing, and the issue with Calamity is that it doesn't offer any sort of energy refund, which is why a lot of people generally recommend you to run Favonius Lance instead of Calamity Queller. I would say this catalyst is going to be quite interesting for buffing any sort of plunging attacks, which is very much accurate to what Shen Yun is able to do. For the next weapon, we have Nahida's best in slot weapon, the 1000 Floating Dreams. So it has a low base attack with a super high elemental mastery stat, and I believe the passive is that if they have the same elemental type as the user, they'll increase even more EM. Otherwise, they increase elemental damage bonus. All nearby party members other than equipping character will have their elemental mastery increased by 40. So it's kind of like I think this is an EM buff and or damage buff depending on what kind of team you have. From what I know about this weapon, I don't think it's really that much different from other weapons like the Sacrificial Fragments, which is advertised right here. And I think her 3-star weapon, the Magic Guide, I think that's the weapon that I'm using right now. All I can really say about this weapon is that it's very replaceable compared to like her other free options, and I think she has other catalysts that are better, but generally catalyst, there's not really that much options for Nahida. I think Sacrificial Fragments is still her best option. So for the 4-star weapons, we have very rare, but we have Quad Sacrificial and Random Lithic Spear, the Racer Spear. I don't know why that's even there. So I'll quickly go over all the different sacrificial weapons. So Sacrificial Bow is mostly only useful on characters like Kujo, Sara, and Diona, because Diona is mostly useful if you want to run her as a battery for hyper carry teams, or maybe a team like Diona in an Ayaka Freeze team for the energy generation, or mostly you can also run her with Eula to mostly just provide energy and a bit of shielding, because Diona's skill does unleash like 5 projectiles. So with Sacrificial Bow, that means that each of these projectiles has a chance to trigger Sacrificial. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, I'm not really sure about that. I'm mostly using my Sacrificial Bow on my Sarah right now because it has a high base attack and it does provide a little bit of ER, but otherwise Favonius is also quite a good option for. In terms of other options, I don't think Sac Bow is really that much useful. You could probably argue you can use it on Kalei, but I much rather have Favonius instead because Favonius not only helps the entire team, it has a very high amount of ER stat, and I don't have to use my elemental skill twice, which is quite annoying to use on Kalei because it does put her in place and you might actually take damage that could be lethal. For Sacrificial Sword, honestly, Xingqiu is probably the only user that can really use it unless you want to run a very specific build with like maybe a Sac Sword on field or Nilo Bloom team. But otherwise, you don't really need R5 for Xingqiu. Ideally, R5 would be great so that you have a higher chance to trigger the energy thing, and it's not even really his best weapon. I think Sac Sword is pretty good if you want to have a very high amount of Hydro particle generation, and the ER substat is basically pretty nice because I think it's about the same as the Favonius Sword at the exact same level. The only difference is really the passive, and I think Fav Sword is just better because you don't have to use your elemental skill twice because doing so will take field time, which you're losing DPS by not using your hyper carries or swapping to other characters or whatnot. And Fav, the energy generation is pretty helpful for non-hydro units. Sacrificial Fragments, oh that's the wrong weapon. Where is my Sacrificial Fragments? Oh right, there it is. So Sacrificial Fragments is only really good on 2 units. The first one being Sucrose, as I'm showing right now, mostly because of the high amount of elemental mastery that it does give, and the passive with the elemental skill reset is especially useful for Sucrose in a lot of different teams where you want to do double swirls, or maybe you want to get that extra energy particle generation because her burst does actually cost like quite a lot at 80. And the only other unit that can really use it, I think, is Nahida, because once again, same reason, it does provide a high amount of elemental mastery, and having the reset is pretty nice. I think it might help with ICD in terms of applying more Dendro, but just having a reset is pretty nice if you do like screw up every now and again. But other than that, I don't think you can really use this on any other characters. Sacrificial Greatsword, I think out of all the entire series, is probably the most useless one right now because high base attack, a decent amount of ER. You could argue that this is going to be decent on Navia because the reset will allow you to do an extra shot, and the ER substat is actually quite useful for someone like Navia, where generally she would be able to use 3 elemental skills in a single rotation, and you wouldn't really need that high of an ER requirement for Navia specifically. But I would say the only other use for Sac Greatsword is probably on someone like Sayu, because Sayu, I mostly use it on my Sayu for overworld exploration so that I can hit an enemy and reset the skill and go even further. But other than that, I think Sac Greatsword is not really that great. And for the last weapon, we have the Lithic Spear, as most people like to call it, or its actual name, Lithic Spear. It provides a bit of attack percent, has a very high base attack for a 4-star character, and the passive makes it so that for every character that comes from leeway in the party, the user gains like an attack buff and a crit rate increase. Mine is at Refinement 4, but if I can get one more copy to put it at Refinement 5, I believe you should be able to get quite a decent amount of crit rate in certain teams, but that completely depends on whether you're running a team that has like full leeway character. Because let's say at default, you put it on someone like Shengling, right? So by default, you're going to get 10% attack, you're going to get a bit of crit rate buff. The high base attack is actually quite welcome for someone like Shengling, but it is definitely a very situational weapon. If you were to look at all the Paul Arm characters that can use it, obviously, the first one is definitely going to be Shengling because she herself is from leeway, and if you do use her in some of her best teams, very likely you're also going to be using other characters from leeway, such as Hu Tao Funeral Rational, because Hu Tao is also on leeway, and that team consists of like what? Hu Tao, Bennett, Shengling, Xingqiu, I believe. So that team already has 3 leeway characters, so that means Shengling can benefit the buffs from quite a lot. I think Hu Tao herself can also use it in certain teams, but I'm not so sure about that. Unless you run like Hu Tao double Hydro with Yelan, Xingqiu, and Shengling at the back, that should be the maximum amount of buffs that you can get from the Lithic Spear. Xiao is going to be quite decent because once again, he's a leeway character and the attack buffs and the crit rate buff is quite welcome. As for the other characters, I don't think there's really all that much uses because it really depends on what kind of teams you want to run. And if you were to think of leeway characters, you have to run a team that somehow has Shengling, Xingqiu, I believe Yelan is somewhere up here if I can find her, maybe Yunjin on your team too. It really depends on what kind of team you intend to run. But in terms of the most popular team, I think Shengling is probably the best user alongside Hu Tao and maybe Xiao. But the problem with the weapon itself is that you really want to get a high refinement if you want to maximize the benefit and for it to really be an upgrade over a lot of the other options. And even if you get it at R1, I think it's going to be okay, but compared to a lot of the other options that you have for free Polearm characters like the Catch, Favonius Lance, or even Dragon's Bane or Cretan Cross Spear for certain characters, Lithic Spear isn't really that much of an upgrade unless you can can really find a reason to like find some way, or you're lucky enough to get it at Refinement 5. But I think that about does it for the banner review. So hopefully you guys found that useful. Personally, I will be pulling for Shen Yun. I will try to guarantee her, and hopefully if I am lucky enough, I can at least try to aim for C2 Faruzan and maybe one copy of Ga-Ming. But if I can get C6 Faruzan, I think that will be very much preferred for my Xiao teams. And for the weapon banner, I'm not going to be pulling because I already have most of the weapons at like R5, and I don't really need the Refinement 5 from Lithic Spear because I have way too much weapons, and that's a problem exclusive to me. I would like to see how strong Shen Yun's weapon is, but I would like to save my pulls to guarantee Yae Miko on the second phase. Anyways, I hope you guys found this video helpful. Once again, let's just do the same as usual. I'm too lazy to mention it. This is going to be an animation that tells you to do the thing, so just do the thing. And most importantly, I really want to hear what you guys think about these banners, and whether like what are you trying to get if you guys are pulling for either Shen Yun or Nahida, or maybe you guys are Wanderer mains, so you're trying to pull for copies of Faruzan, or you are a soon-to-be Ga-Ming main trying to play a C6 plunging attack 4-star DPS, and maybe you're going for the weapon banner. So just share your thoughts and opinions on whether you're pulling the banner or not, and why you are pulling for them, like what's the reason, so that we can all have a good conversation down in the comment section. Anyways, that is it for now. This is Ethereal signing off.